And
Good morning, everyone. My name's Heath Curry. I'm an EAL lead with Anglophone School District West. Today, we're going to be talking about some simple scaffolds to support multilingual language learners, MLLs, in your classes, which are really just some easy ways to adjust your lessons and instructional practices to better support the students you teach. And I'm joined by two of my lovely colleagues.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Marr, and I'm an EAL lead primarily responsible for schools in the Woodstock Ed Center.
And I'm Stephanie Henry, also a lead in Fredericton Ed Center and Ormocto as well. All right, so we're going to get started today. Let's start with a learning objective for this presentation. By the end of this presentation, you will be familiar with simple scaffolds that you can begin using immediately to support multilingual language learners, or MLLs, in academic and mainstream classes and in a variety of learning situations, specifically at the start of your class, when the teacher is speaking at the front of the class, when new vocabulary is introduced, during learning activities such as reading, writing, discussion activities, and at the end of class. So what are some little things that you can do at all of these points throughout a lesson to easily support the language learners that might be sitting in your classroom?
So getting started, I just wanted to discuss briefly the CEFR, which stands for the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So you will see in PowerSchool the levels associated with English language level. And what these mean is that you start with A1, which would indicate a beginner. And if we see A1.1 in PowerSchool, that means they're very new to English. Going beyond that, we get up to A2 and then B1. And the scale actually goes all the way to C2, but the C levels really don't require any support in terms of linguistic scaffolds and that sort of thing. So what we will see is levels A1, A2, B1 associated with students in PowerSchool. And once they go beyond B1, they sort of become a B2 learner, we generally consider universal accommodations enough linguistically for students to have success in classes, so you won't see that recorded. So what you will see is A1, A2, B1 no longer require support in PowerSchool, just for your own purposes.
And I'll add before we move on that you're going to find that information about your MLLs in the globe within PowerSchool.
So the CEFR breaks down language by sort of descriptors at different levels. So giving a presentation is the example on this slide. So we can see at A1.1, an A1.1 learner can read individual words. I can read individual words. As they progress in their linguistic journey, I can read a very short rehearsed statement. Moving on to A2, I can give a short rehearsed basic presentation on a familiar subject. You'll notice that A1.1 and A1.2, A1 is subdivided into two levels, which we do at A2 and B1 as well. For the case of illustrating this point here, we're only going to have A2 and B1 with 1 point. We get onto B1, I can give a straightforward prepared presentation on a familiar topic within my field. And to B2, I can give a clear prepared presentation. You'll notice these little rocks and boulders in the pathway here. And this is sort of to illustrate that we want to take those big assessments, those big pieces that they're sort of boulders and harder to overcome, the obstacles, and we want to break them into smaller, manageable chunks, kind of make them into little pebbles that students can get past more readily and access the curriculum and access the content of your course and have success. And that's what those are meant to illustrate here. So, which leads me to the idea of the cycle of backwards design planning. And this is with a specific linguistic lens. So what we want to do with the content class is identify the essential learning for the outcome. So what do students really need to be able to do to meet this outcome? The next thing we want to do is provide opportunities for students to show their learning. In a typical backwards design plan, this would be planning the assessment piece. What are the products? What are we actually looking for? And then lastly, we're going to plan learning and instruction that is linguistically accessible. So here, what are the tasks we're asking of students? Okay, how do we have to break these tasks down? So what can I expect of students at these different CEFR levels? Well, NA 1.1 would read and write high frequency keywords. This is just a very, very general description of what you might expect in a class. NA 1.2 could read and write sentences with one idea using high frequency keywords and vocabulary. You'll notice that there's just little tweaks in the wording as these levels go up. A2, read and write short texts about familiar topics. Familiarity being key there. B1, reading for detail and identifying secondary arguments within a text, writing well-organized texts that are written with increasing accuracy and detail, nuance to convey information or creativity. Some people like to think of the A1.1 as word level, basic sentence level at A1.2, working on paragraphs at A2, at B1 connecting paragraphs or mastering paragraphs, and then B2 and on, we're working more at sort of universal accommodations, as mentioned before, are enough to allow student success in most content classes.
So now that you know more or less, what those language learners in your room are capable of doing, we're going to talk more directly about the scaffolds that you can use. All the scaffolds that we're talking about today are things that you can do with little to no prep, and that will not or that will benefit all of the learners in your classroom, not just the English language learners. So that's a really important point, is that nothing that you're doing here is taking away from the educational experience of the students in the room. Every single one of them will benefit from the educational scaffolds and the linguistic scaffolds that you build into your lesson. So any of these things that you want to try out, they're only going to improve the experience of your learners. So the first thing we're going to talk about is some things that you might try at the beginning of class. Okay, so if you do some of the things on the left, such as, when kids are coming in, you're answering the question, what are we doing today? What are we doing today? If you usually would post the curricular outcome up on the board or in some spot in your room, or if you would normally start your class by sharing an agenda of the lesson, there's a few tweaks that you can try that extend those scaffolds a little bit more for the language learners. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in a little more detail is following a routine. You can also do things like warm-ups and bell works. We're actually going to talk about that along with the routine in a minute. And annotating the learning outcome. So these are all things that we'll talk about a little bit more.
So in this slide, we see a picture of a famous New Brunswick icon, and the students are posed the question, where is this? Name the place and what province is it in? So this was a routine and a warm-up for a grade 9 social studies Canadian identities class, in which the students were accessing the content of GCO2, which is students will explore Canadian physical and human geography. So 5 minutes at the beginning of every class, students would be able to search with their phones, try to identify an icon or landscape or something significant to Canadian identities, and name the province and the place. And it was just an engaging way to start the lesson and also to expose students and build background knowledge, which not all students have that are coming to Canada. And this particular class was composed of primarily newcomer students.
And routines are so important for our language learners, especially those A1 language learners, because it allows them to take the focus off of the conversations and the instructions that are going on around them and focus on the learning that's taking place, because they know what to expect and they know what is going to happen. So now we're going to talk about annotating the learning outcome. So we all know that learning outcomes are, what we're teaching, okay? And annotating that learning outcome will help increase comprehension of what you're doing at the vocabulary level as well. So you can see in the image here, annotating is kind of looking at those academic terms, the vocabulary words that kids would need to understand or learn, and talking about what those words mean. And you can do that at the beginning of every class. You could decide if you wanted kids to write it down, having them choral read and different things like that. So we're actually going to watch a video of this happening, and you can see what it looks like.
So we got a little jumbled around complementary angles. So I'm gonna go ahead and move my finger and we're gonna read with my finger because I couldn't hear if we all said the words correctly. So let's try that again. 1, 2.
By the end of class, I will be able to identify and solve for complementary angles and supplementary angles by subtracting the correct angle measurement.
Beautiful. So much better.
Yeah, it helps a lot. And
How does it help?
How does it help? Yeah, but how does it help? How does it help?
instead of the teacher saying it, like we say it, and like if we say it, then we can like we learn it better. Like like I think so.
Well, yeah, because somebody said somebody tell me I need some help with this, and this is a big one. I have middle schools that are telling me the kids, middle schoolers, think that's babyish to read it up.
It's not babyish.
I know.
It's not baby, it's
But
different.
you-
Understand it when people read out loud and start reading in their head.
Nice.
And we can, when we speak to each other, we can learn it.
Yeah. Speaking to each other. You read just the vocabulary sometimes, just the harder words.
Well, we read that and then we write sentences.
Nice. You write sentences about it?
Usually, but we put vocabulary words so we can understand more.
98% or 96% of our students are Hispanic and 96 are free and reduced lunch. We always choral read our objective every day. I spend a good almost 5 to 6 minutes on it, different ways to do it. So math vocabulary is very big, especially with the STAR test. They're not always going to give you pictures or things like that. So I went to a training with Miss Silva and Joseph, and what really hit hard was that I wanted my kids to make sure that they felt comfortable in my class to even try those vocabulary words in class.
Okay, so they're going to go on to talk about another concept, but you can see there the value of having students use those academic words in order to help them retain those words. We just give them the word or look at the word or say the word as the teacher at the front of the room, but they're not actually using that word, then it's going to just fly by them. They're probably not going to remember most of it. But having them use that vocabulary, think about what those words mean, it's going to help them retain that for much longer. So when you are speaking in the front of the room, we know that, as teachers, a large part of our job, an important part of our job is giving oral instructions and teaching to the class. And so we spend time doing that. But we can make it more accessible to language learners and at the same time, the rest of the students in the classroom. So if you tend to give a lot of oral instructions, go over PowerPoints, explain concepts, especially if you're doing it for a long period of time, lecture, ask questions kind of in a popcorn fashion, back and forth, or do a lot of, check for understanding. Okay, here's a few things that you might try to make it more accessible. So first, increasing student talk time, having students talk as much as possible within the lesson is again going to help them retain that information because they're the ones using the words and the language. Choral reading, like we saw in the video, same concept again, just getting them to use the language. Refer to visuals. As language teachers, we like to say that you should use your walls kind of as a co-teacher. So having visuals and things around the room that you can refer to frequently as you are talking will help a student who doesn't have that language make those connections between the words you're saying that they might not understand and the concept that they might understand. And two things we're going to talk about in a little bit more are using PowerPoint live captions. I'm going to show you how to do that. And kind of a strategy called instead of I don't know. So let's look at those. PowerPoint has a feature that allows you to put captions on the screen. And especially for your older learners, maybe middle school, depending on the student, but definitely in high school, if your students are literate in their home language, you can do that by putting their home language translated, translating what you're saying at the bottom of the screen as you use PowerPoint. So you can see in the picture on the screen where it says, "How do oceans work?" The text is in English and the teacher is explaining that text in English. But I know it's very small, but if you can see it, down at the bottom of the screen, there's an automatic translation of the spoken words that are popping up in the language that was selected in the settings. And so that looks like Spanish to me. So if we selected the Spanish option, everything the teacher is saying in English is being translated. So, you know, those translations, those automatic translations are never perfect, but it's going to help with the comprehension for that A1 learner. And so, you know, if you want to pause this video and try that out, you can. You can follow the instructions that are on the slide, but setting that up, you know, you go to slideshow and then choose subtitle settings, select the spoken language, select the subtitle language, and choose where you want the text to show up on the screen. A few other things that you can do in the more settings from there, you can adjust the font size, the style, the color, the background, the color, and transparency. And you can see there too, while you're presenting, where you would go to do that down in the settings still. So that's a really, really easy way for you to kind of create a more welcoming and inclusive environment for students. This next strategy is a way that you can make questioning and comprehension checks more useful for all of the learners in the classroom. It does require a little bit of preparation and pre-teaching and routine to make it part of your classroom culture. But once you've done that, it can really transform your classroom. So we all know that a lot of times when we have students who either don't know an answer or don't want to participate, the automatic go-to is, I don't know the answer, even if they do know the answer. And so coming up with other options as answers is a way around that. And it works great for our language learners, as well as other students in the class who might just not be engaged for whatever reason. So, you know, we outlaw or you know, take away, I don't know as an answer, and come up with other possibilities, such as, can I ask someone for help? Can I have some time to think or figure this out? Would you repeat the question? And, you know, you can come up and brainstorm with your students tons and tons of other options in order to get around that, you know, cop out of saying, I don't know. Because if you're teaching it and you're asking them that question, they should be able to answer it. You could just put that up on the wall and you know, you refer back to it throughout your lessons. All right. So the next thing that we'll get into is things to try when new vocabulary is being introduced, whether you're introducing it as a teacher or using it and students are using it throughout the lesson. Okay, we all have academic vocabulary that goes along with the subjects we are teaching, whether that be math, science, social studies, history, art, tech. All of those classes have their own words and vocabulary that students have to learn. Often you might just give them a vocabulary list that they reference. They might look up definitions. They might do a matching activity with a definition and a word. You might just explain vocabulary as it comes up in your lesson and say, you know, oh, by the way, that word means this, kind of explaining it in context. Instead of those, or in addition to those things, there's some other ways that you can be a little more inclusive and that students might retain the vocabulary and the meanings a little more and be able to access those words and use them better. The first thing that I would say would be interactive word walls. Word walls in general from K to 12 are beneficial. And an interactive word wall just means that it's not a list of words that you're posting on the wall at the start of the year or the start of the unit and then leaving there. It's words that you are posting throughout your lessons and throughout the unit as they come up. So as you find out that there's a word that a student doesn't understand, or the class doesn't understand, or it's a new vocabulary word that's important for them to learn, that's when you're putting it up. It's interactive, it's done with the class. You can also add images to a word wall. You can ask students to, language learners, to translate words into their own language, get them to write a translation on a sticky note and put a sticky note next to the English word. There's lots of great things that you can do with a word wall to make it something that students reference and use to their benefit. So we're also going to talk about a few other things that are really great for vocabulary. Labeling an image and a specific strategy called Picture Word Induction Model, or PWIM. Previewing keywords. We're going to show you a great website for figuring out what words needs to be previewed, and highlighting academic vocabulary.
Okay, this is me. So one thing to consider when thinking about vocabulary are the tiers of vocabulary. And words can be separated into 3 tiers of vocabulary. Tier 1 words are common words that are used in everyday spoken situations. And tier 2 words are those that are used frequently across subject areas. Tier 3 words are lower frequency words that are specific to particular content areas. These are necessary to know in order to access the content of the subject area. So on the next slide, here's an example from the grade 7 math curriculum. And this example looks at the number strand and the big ideas. The big idea is operations. When looking at the skill descriptors, we can identify words that students would need to know. In the tier 2 vocabulary section, students would need to understand, explain, estimate, demonstrate, justify. And when looking at some of the tier 3 vocabulary, we might pull out integers, add, subtract, divisors, fractions, quotients, products, and sum. So it's important to intentionally teach these tier 2 and 3 vocabulary terms so that students could learn and master the concepts. Perfect. Okay. One sec. So on this slide, we have WordSift. And this is a website that can be used to highlight important vocabulary terms that should be previewed and taught in a particular text or unit. So I looked at an example from an article, 40 million and counting. Canada hits a new population milestone. And it was taken from What in the World Current Events publication. So this article links to grade 6 social studies and the big idea of civic engagement. After cutting and pasting the article into WordSift, which you'll see on the next slide, the words are presented in a word cloud. And as you can see, the important vocabulary terms are highlighted visually and can be of assistance when planning and delivering lessons. That's a really neat site to use. I'm sure that some of you may have used it before, but it does, the words that are bigger are the words that might be used more often in the article or in the unit as well. So it could be very beneficial.
Okay, so picture word inductive model is a vocabulary strategy that I think it is probably commonly used in, I've seen it used in kindergarten classrooms a lot, but with language learners and anyone who's learning vocabulary, it's a great activity to build vocabulary. And personally, as a classroom teacher, I used this in language classes, but also in a History 11-2 class. Okay, so this is not something that's just, just for the younger grades. It does work across all grades. And basically, how it works is, you choose an image that relates to the lesson or the unit that you're studying. And you either along with students at the front of the room or have students in small groups label all of the things that they can from that image. They're naturally going to need to label the nouns, but they could also, you can encourage them to label adjectives, so describing words, verbs, and other parts of speech. You might encourage, depending on the age level of your students, other things to be added. You know, maybe you're working on proper nouns or, you know, different types of words. This is great as an interactive activity because kids are going to get involved, and it's going to match their level of speech. It's a great way, like I said, to review academic vocabulary, also to work on spelling at the higher levels, especially at the higher levels. And from here, you know, if you did this as a warm-up, for example, or a review activity for a class, your language learners could then use this as a support for the ongoing lessons, right? So maybe your Canadian English first language students might put it away and not come back to it, but they can use that as a support throughout the lessons. You can also get them after the picture has been labeled to, you know, title the picture, to use those words to create sentences or paragraphs, or different things like that.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about semantic maps next. So this is the strategy that I would use as more of a review. So once vocabulary has been sort of learned throughout a unit, let's say, then I might have students work in pairs to try to categorize the different things associated with the theme. So in this case, we have like grade 5 math theme of measure and measurement, and then sort of some subcategories like distance, time, dimensions, area, volume, things that we measure. So I would have students work in, let's say, small groups or even in pairs, and then move to groups, and then sort of as a whole class, and try to make one large semantic map together with the most comprehensive one we can and combine with all the groups. And then that becomes an anchor chart and an easy reminder of how these things are connected and all the vocabulary that we've acquired throughout the unit. Lots of different ways that you can engage with semantic maps, but it's also kind of reminiscent of a brainstorm that you would see or a spider web. But in this case, the target is to review and consolidate vocabulary. So some other strategies would be Frere model, which we see on the top right here, where the word goes in the middle. And then you would have a definition, characteristics, examples, and non-examples. So if I were to put a word, let's say from, let's say identity, and then I would give a definition, which I would allow them to do in their home language as well. So if they wanted to translate it, and then I would encourage an English simplified definition if appropriate, or the dictionary definition, whatever. It's sort of path of least resistance, in my opinion, with vocabulary. So what works, and some characteristics. So maybe there could be some synonyms or what that might look like. Examples, perhaps the word in context where they might have encountered it in a text or another example. And then the non-examples is sort of like, it could be an antonym, but it could just be something that could be similar, but not exactly the same. So like identity, it's not really nationality necessarily, right? Maybe it's part of it. So that's one sometimes you have to be a little bit creative with, but the idea is that, okay, this could be confused with this and it doesn't mean that. Or it could be this as an adjective. The other example on the bottom left here is just sort of a student's vocabulary journal in which they would have the keyword. Now this is one that the teacher might have provided, but essentially the idea is that there's a keyword, there's some basic description, there's an image provided, or the students could draw the image themselves. So the expectation is they illustrate that word if it's appropriate. And then there's a box there for a translation. And again, I would encourage a systematic approach and something that is routine and something that works for you and your students, rather than promote one specific model. But I think having something that helps the students learn that vocabulary and keep track of it, and being able to individualize and personalize these sort of dictionaries and vocabulary journals is a great way to help with that.
Okay, so let's move on to, you know, the middle part of your class where you've started to kind of pass over the responsibility of the learning to the students, and they're completing some learning activities. So typically you would probably do some group work or have a discussion. You might assign a reading with some questions. You might ask students to write a response to something or a reflection, answer some questions in writing, or you might show a video. So there's things that we can do, again, to make that more accessible to the language learners in your classroom and scaffold the learning that's coming from these activities. So let's look at several of those. The first thing that you can do is if you're showing a YouTube video, okay, similar to what I showed you for PowerPoints, you can do a few things to YouTube videos or with YouTube videos to help those language learners. So the first thing I would encourage you to do, if it's appropriate, would be to get the transcript. So within YouTube, most of the time, not all the time, but there's usually a transcript of the words from that video that you can literally copy and paste into a Word document that student could, so that the student could follow along. Okay, you might also consider, taking out a few of those words so that the student could complete it as a closed activity, right? A fill in the blank. But just giving them the words so that they can both see what's being said and hear what's being said is going to help a language learner with that task. You can also show the closed captions or subtitles within a YouTube video. You can show it in chunks. That's a really great thing, especially if it's a longer video. We don't want to show a 30-minute video from start to finish because the students are probably not going to follow along for that length of time. They're going to miss things that are important. But if you show it in chunks, so pause and recap every few minutes or every section of that video to talk about what they have seen and what they have learned. It could be just pause and turn to your partner and summarize what we've seen so far. Or you could try some of the apps that are out there. Things like Edpuzzle are kind of interactive ways to use videos where questions would pop up. The students could answer the questions on their device and submit it, and the teacher gets feedback about whether those answers were correct or incorrect. So there's different things you can do with YouTube links. There's lots and lots of different tech out there now that we can take advantage of. The last thing that I want to suggest is to slow down that video. So often those YouTube videos, people speak so fast. And so you can slow it down. And that's what you're seeing in the picture here is how to do that. You will click on the settings icon, and then it will show speed. The speed will probably be set to normal, but you can change that speed. 0.5 often feels a little too slow, but I find even 0.8 slows it down enough for a language learner, but the rest of the kids in the class won't notice that it's been slowed down unless you tell them. Sometimes the video, even a 0.9, is kind of that in between. You can play with it a little bit, but just taking that extra 3 seconds to slow the video down will help your language learners be able to understand what they're hearing. All right, so this is a great strategy that we like a lot for including language learners in the classroom. It's called QSSA, and you can see those letters stand for question, signal, STEM, share, assess. And this is an alternative to kind of just questioning that you would throw out, or discussions where you're posing a question to the entire class, or even in small groups. And often you have a few students who are not participating, language learners being one of those common groups who wouldn't be participating in that kind of a situation. So if you follow this structured kind of layout for presenting those questions, it makes it more accessible. So we're going to watch an example here in a moment. However, basically you would give them the question. Okay, so you give them whatever your question is. Signal means that you're giving them think time. So you're saying to the class, okay, class, Take a second, don't yell out the answer to the question. Once it's in your head, then you are going to raise your hand or you're going to touch your nose or whatever it is that you want them to do. You're also giving them a stem. Okay, the stem is helping them figure out what their answer needs to be. So it means you're giving them the beginning of that sentence. So if your question was, for example, you can see on the board, why is protein transport essential for the proper functioning of a cell? Okay, well, protein transport is essential for the functioning of the cell because you're giving them that, and then they can add in their ideas, but they know that they're on the right track. And after they've had that think time and they've come up with their answers, they all have their finger on their nose, then you have the share, and it's a low pressure share with, you know, their group or a partner, their elbow partner, the person next to them. They're comparing their answers. They're practicing saying that sentence stem with their own idea attached. And then the assess part is where you as the teacher would ask for some answers, or you know, there's different ways of doing it. If you wanted them to then write their answer on an exit slip, or write down their answer as a response, or just share their answers as a group, whatever it is that you want to do. So let's have a look at this in action.
Now is I'm just going to get you to give me the fingers. So we've done this before. 3 means you think you could give me an answer. And I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, so don't stress about it. But 3, you got it. Okay, you're like, yeah, I read the question, I understand it, I could give you something. 2, you're like, yeah, I could probably tell you something, but I don't really know the whole story. And 1, you're not really certain how to. And I want you to discuss that question, and I want you to use one of the 2 stems. So I want you to actually say it, okay, so that the person at your table can hear what you're saying. You could say protein transport through a cell is important because, and then give what you think the answer is. Or you could use the other stem. I think proteins move through a cell because. Okay, and as you're answering that question, I want you to try to envision, okay, the picture that we drew together. So we've done.
It's made of protein, and it's essential for our body parts to require protein and like properly function.
So why do you think protein transport is important in a cell?
I think that protein transport inside the cell is important so that you can get kind of different types of proteins for different.
I think it's because it's for balancing and keeping the cell and organism alive.
That's pretty much exactly what Brianna said. That's great.
That's right.
Yeah.
I thought the strategy was really helpful because it's nice to hear what my peers have to say, and having a sentence to go off of helps start the conversation.
Okay, so we saw there that, you know, that the students again are using the academic vocabulary. They have that interaction, personal interaction with the content that is so essential in order for them to retain what they're learning.
So just talking briefly about graphic organizers here. So here it says what your brainstorm might look like one of these examples. So the concept of brainstorming might not be familiar to some students, particularly students who have come from different education systems and educational backgrounds. And I wanted to speak to the importance of modeling and really teaching the graphic organizer to students. So we might give an example or model it with a teacher's freehand on the left, and perhaps provide some different options of how this might look, depending on learner preferences, organization of ideas. So in the middle, we see we have boxes, and then we might facilitate bullet points and subcategories, whereas the other one is more of a word web and kind of a freer forming version of the freehand one on the left. And really, in my experience with graphic organizers is that they're very beneficial, but just giving one isn't enough. So it really does need to be taught to students intentionally. So here's an example from, in this case, is also a grade 9 social studies class, in which there was a lot of A2 students, so learners who were just working on, they were able to write sentences, but putting together a paragraph was still a challenge. So here we thought, well, maybe we should chunk this a little bit. So this was a model of how do we write a paragraph based on what we're doing. In this particular case, they would have had a reading text about rights and responsibilities of Canadian citizens. And we would have chunked that and allowing them to identify 3 rights and 3 key responsibilities. Then they were supposed to write a paragraph about rights and a different paragraph about responsibilities. So this was helpful in that really they just had to identify, they already had identified the 3 points they wanted to make. So then it's just writing a sentence about why that's important. Okay, so we have 3 details, 3 sentences, 3 rights, but then we have to include a topic sentence to sort of introduce it and a closing sentence to kind of close that paragraph. So this was a visual and structured and scaffolded way of getting students to write paragraphs about a content related topic within that class. And who doesn't like a hamburger? Another example from the same class is a paragraph frame. So we have sentence stems and sentence frames, which we encourage in all classes as well. And the idea being that you have a word missing or just a prompt, as we saw in the QSSA. With the paragraph frame, the paragraph is sort of structured, or something resembling a paragraph is structured, in which they just have to kind of find key missing items. So there is some learner agency here. They can choose which flag they like, for example, research that flag, talk about what it represents. And one interesting thing they found out about that province or flag, and if I ever had a chance to visit said province, what would you do there? So that gives them a lot to think about. However, most of that structural language is already given. So it's just the content that needs to be filled in. And that's really the thing I wanted to highlight with this slide and this strategy. And it can be applied to any class. We saw something sort of similar in the QSSA, but that's more about the sentence and free response level, and this would be more of a writing scaffold.
All right, so we're coming up to the end of class now, and we just have a couple of last, final suggestions for you. So typically at the end of class, you might spend the last few minutes giving them time to work on homework. You might give them an exit slip for formative assessment, or you might just say, all right, thanks, have a great day, goodbye everyone, the bell's gone. So if you have that time at the end of your class, there's a few things that you can do that might help prepare them, the language learners in particular, but everyone, for the next day. So things like reviewing the next lesson topic and keywords. For a language learner, that will help them to kind of prepare themselves for the next day. And that can become a habit where, maybe you're giving them a few keywords that they're going to go home and find out what those mean in their home language and maybe connect to some of their prior learning or experiences. You could go further and you could assign a video for them to preview that topic before the lesson the next day. Maybe you have a team where you want to post a video or, just send a link home that's going to kind of maybe fill in some gaps, things that, most of the students in your class might already know. Maybe they've forgotten some of the details though, and they're going to, review that. But for a language learner who has learned, completed some of their education elsewhere, maybe they don't have some of that prior knowledge. So giving them access to that beforehand might allow them to prepare themselves for your lesson. If you're giving exit slips, give them a sentence frame with that exit slip. We saw the sentence frames before. So again, it's taking the language level or the language out of that task and just asking them to share their knowledge and their learning.
Just sort of to reiterate, for scaffolding that works for language learners, works for everybody, as we've seen in these videos, interviews, and examples. So graphic organizers, comprehensible input, so making sure that the content is being understood and engaging students, eliciting from students to kind of have these little check-ins to make sure they're understanding, sentence frames, sentence stems, and vocabulary, intentional vocabulary instruction. We'll just leave it at that. So this works for everybody from A1 to C2 to native speaker, just best practice.
This is another great one. If you want to take a quick screenshot and print that out to have as reference on your wall, these are things that you can use all the time that are always going to benefit the learners in front of you. So just finishing up now today, thank you so much for watching this video, following along with us. If there's any of these strategies or programs or ideas that we presented today that you would like to learn more about, or you want to try it out but you're not quite there yet, reach out to us. We're happy to come in and work with you. One of us is assigned to every school in ASD West, so send us an email and we can come in and help you out with those things. You know, that's our job, is to help you teach the language learners that are in your classroom. So we want to make sure that that is something that you can do and that you're comfortable with.